Good afternoon, Dr. Chris Keefer. Welcome back to the podcast. I appreciate your time for round two.
Yeah, it's great to be back, man. Thanks for having me, Trevor.
For the listener, as a recap, you are a practicing doctor and the president of Canadians for Nuclear Energy, as well as the host of the Decouple Podcast, which covers all things energy, if I'm correct.
Yeah, we have certainly a focus on nuclear energy, but we tackle with some broader themes. We nerd out on deep geologic time. Particularly as that pertains to energy and hydrocarbons, but also tangle some of these philosophical and political questions about fundamentally how do we provide the gains that we've seen in terms of industrial civilization. Like, people tend to gloss over the fact, especially the environmental crowd that wants a nostalgic return to the good old days. They forget that half of children died before the age of 5 in the pre-industrial era. So basically, decouple means how can we preserve those benefits while stewarding our resources, taking care of the environment, etc. But yeah, we're nuclear nerds anyway. That's decouple.
As a practicing doctor, I hope you weren't up all night last night. I caught you at a good time. You're in a good mood.
Yeah. No, it's all good. It's all good. Even if I was up all night, we bounce back.
For the purposes of this conversation, I am by no means a nuclear expert, but I thought we could frame it around an educational perspective for the listener. And what I am passionate about is energy and its importance to technological development and human prosperity. So we could start there and get your thoughts on nuclear and how it's shifted the last few years and the importance. I think that's the case. So maybe why is the sentiment towards nuclear shifting nowadays?
Yeah, so first off, in nuclear energy is an important part of the global energy mix. It's focused in, just over 30 countries around the world, ranging in the percentage of the mix that it comprises. But on the high end, places like France have been as high as 75% nuclear powered in terms of their electricity. Although some of that electricity is then used for things like space heating and running really fast trains and things like that. In the US, 20% of electricity is nuclear. Canada, it's about 15%. And where I'm talking to you from, Ontario, we have sat sort of 50 to 60% nuclear power in terms of electricity. So in the niches where it fits best, it can become a really important part of a country or a province's mix. And why it's back in the zeitgeist has a lot to do with a couple of factors. Climate certainly played a role in terms of making nuclear a sort of a bipartisan or pan-partisan issue. Amongst all of the discord in the United States, for instance, there's strong support for nuclear energy on both sides of the House. The Republicans and Democrats seems to be the only thing they can agree on for now, anyway. And so climate sort of brought the left to the table. And concerns around energy security really came to the fore after the Russians invaded Ukraine. Europe had been in a sort of degrowth spiral, shutting down their nuclear plants, kind of for fun or for philosophical reasons. And so I'd say those two things played a major role. And we are seeing, as you said, a real revival of interest. So in Ontario here, we are constructing the only nuclear power plants under active construction, probably in the Western Hemisphere, certainly in North America. Plans to build a lot more large nuclear here in Ontario, and obviously interest in other provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Nova Scotia recently joining in the crew. And lots of talk anyway in the United States, and we'll see if and when that turns into action.
So the basic idea is that energy is causal to the development of technology. And so basically you need one before you get the other, and that will result in human prosperity. But what role do you think nuclear energy can play in that, system, and how much potential is there right now?
Yeah, as you mentioned, there's really no such thing as a low energy, high GDP type country. So energy is really the backbone of progress and comfort, and again, healthcare, education, everything that we sort of take for granted in a modern industrialized society, and lots of things that we particularly take for granted, which is all of the manufacturing and heavy industry, which we forget about because most of it's happening overseas in the West here. So again, nuclear plays an important role in in certain niches in particular. So if you don't have coal, if you don't have gas, if you don't have oil, nuclear is an amazing source of energy because you can import a tiny volume of uranium. You can store years worth of energy on site because the energy density of uranium is 70,000 times that of natural gas, for instance. And so for places like Ontario, that explains, why is it that Ontario is 50-60% nuclear powered? Well, again, we didn't have coal, we didn't have gas, we had a little bit of oil back in the day. So we were very dependent on imports of coal, a little bit from Western Canada, but mostly across the Great Lakes, from Appalachia and some of the big coal basins with access to the Great Lakes. Unstable prices. We didn't have energy security. So big role there. If you think about Japan prior to Fukushima, 30% nuclear heading towards 40. I mean, that was the second largest economy in the world, in the 70s and 80s, and imported about 90% of its energy. And so nuclear was a great way for them to have energy security, have some stability amidst sort of more volatile commodity prices like coal and liquefied natural gas. So nuclear makes sense some places. And I will say and acknowledge, as much as I'm a nuclear advocate, it is probably the most challenging source of energy. You really need to devote a lot of societal resources, human resources in particular. It takes a lot of expertise to do it because you have to do it well, not just from a safety perspective, but from a getting it built, getting it done perspective. And so in some places, again, it makes a lot more sense than others. And so it's interesting, talk about nuclear now in Western Canada, which is fairly gas rich in particular. Saskatchewan is actually a place where nuclear is looking like it's going to move forward. We have Premier Mo and the big institution, SaskPower, really bullish on nuclear. And it's partially as a hedge against, they import most of their gas from Alberta. It's partially a hedge against rising gas prices as we start to export LNG out of Western Canada. So hopefully that gives yourself and your listeners a perspective on sort of where that niche is for nuclear. Every energy source is going to work better, under a different set of conditions. And the aforementioned examples are kind of where nuclear comes in.
But the basic idea is that we need all forms of energy, and basically the more the better, because it helps build technology and make human lives better, I think is a good way to sum it up.
Yeah, I mean, you can take it to sort of really ridiculous realms. There's a forget his name, but there's a professor who looks at, sort of because energy and GDP are essentially correlated, something like 95%. If the economy were to continue to grow and compound at 3% per year and energy followed that, I forget, but it's something like in 500 years, we would have so much waste heat because, again, all these thermal power stations reject energy. That's part of thermodynamics, part of how thermal power generation plants work. The waste heat would eventually boil off the oceans, right? And eventually we'd be creating more energy than sun. So it gets preposterous at a certain point. But yes, I would largely agree with your conclusion that lots of energy is a good thing and results in abundance and better cost of living. And healthier lives, seeing that from a physician perspective.
And I think it's not even the argument, it's not correlated, it's actually causal, because basic engineering requires energy, and it's actually one helps the other. And then you need energy to move things around, build things, power your power plants, take out the trash, and basically everything in life requires it. So I'm not sure if correlated is the right word, but that's my understanding.
Yeah. Well, I think it's going to be both caused and correlated, right? But causation is stronger, and I'll agree with you there, my friend.
But the problem is, through the 70s, the total energy output for humans kind of plateaued, and for reasons that maybe are debatable, one of which is the far left environmental movement kind of put a damper on nuclear energy, but it seems to have revived itself nowadays. You kind of mentioned energy shortages as one reason, but are you more optimistic that the momentum will keep going?
I mean, I'd have to look at some more data. My impression is certainly in the West, energy use plateaued in the 70s. And in big part, that was as a result of the OPEC crisis, the skyrocketing price of oil, the inflationary result of the price of energy going up, economic slowing and recession in the 80s. So there was sort of a bit of a saturation in the West. But let's not forget that India and China picked up that slack in the 80s, 90s, 2000s. So I think if you look at it in a global perspective, we have continued continued to add energy. But you're absolutely right. In the West, energy use plateaued. So if you look at, utility executive that was building power plants in the 50s or 60s when the grid was growing every year by 7 or 8%,
Okay.
in a single career, you might see the area that you're responsible, the power generation, 5, 6, 8x. And what we've seen in the West more recently is, a lot of that infrastructure that was built in the 60s, 70s, 80s is heading towards end of life. We're sort of replacing it, but there's not a lot of energy addition. And so, yeah, certainly we have seen that plateau. And I think it's hard to argue that hasn't had an impact on, what could have been if we'd been using more energy. At the same point, there is, to some degree, a little bit of a saturation point that starts to hit. Part of that, again, will have to do as well with offshoring and heavy electricity users, for instance, in aluminum smelting and a lot of other sectors. A lot of that business, manufacturing, et cetera, moved overseas. So that's, again, part of the plateauing. But I would argue, again, that on a global level, we've just seen a continual rise in energy use.
This episode is brought to you by Bedell Gas Compression. Proud to be recognized as an industry leader, Bedell Gas Compression specializes in reliable, custom-engineered natural gas compression solutions that support efficient operations. Backed by experienced field service and an unwavering commitment to safety and performance, Bedell is a trusted partner in the field. From flexible rental options to fully customized new builds, the Bedell team focuses on operational efficiency, safety, and long-term performance, helping producers keep gas moving where it matters most. Learn more at bedell.com. Which nuclear can help feed the demands?
It can, yeah, under the right circumstances. And again, it's a tricky technology. I will say nuclear is not it's not a nice to have technology, it's a need to have technology. So if you're swimming in oil and gas and coal, there's not a strong imperative to build nukes. And that's why we don't see them built in those kind of environments, with a few exceptions. I was visiting the United Arab Emirates a couple of years ago. I was actually at the big climate conference they hosted there. But we got to tour their large reactors. Korea came in and helped them build 4 giant 1,400 megawatt reactors. So in total, enough power for sort of like 6 million households. Just it's like a pyramid in the desert of power. And I was like, well, this sort of goes against my thesis of need to have versus nice to have technology. And what was interesting was learning that the UAE exports oil. It doesn't actually produce a lot of gas. So they were importing a lot of gas from Qatar. They wanted to deal with that. They're using a lot for desalination, for power production. And so they built a bunch of nuclear. So again, you build nuclear where you don't have another choice or another option, or where you'd rather not be dependent on unreliable neighbors, et cetera. So yes, it can absolutely play that role in energy abundance, but it's going to do so in areas where you really need the power. So for Alberta, for instance, certainly there's sort of decarbonization pressures on the oil industry out there. Can it be made more competitive in a world? I don't know. The ESG moment seems to be fading, but lower carbon oil may potentially still have some benefits. So can we run SAGD operations using other forms of thermal power? Can nuclear fit that role? Maybe. It's tricky because your SAGD operations around for 20 years, 25 years. The nuclear power plant you build, ideally, because it's got a high capital cost, you want it to operate for 50, 60 years. There's probably some creative solutions, but it's a harder sell, as I said, in places that are swimming in hydrocarbons and coal.
There are power plants Gen 1, 2, 3, and 4, I think, is being worked on right now. And one of the strengths Canada has is the CANDU reactor. So what are the difference between those generations, and how does the CANDU reactor fit in?
Yeah, it's interesting. So Gen 1 would be referring mostly to sort of prototypes, very early experiments with nuclear energy in the 50s, I would say. Gen 2, a lot of those reactors are still running. Those were built in the 60s and 70s in particular. They, as nuclear progressed and we had some accidents, just like in the airline industry, we made improvements and engineering improvements in particular to make the plants safer, to have safety systems that sort of worked with physics. And that really came to the fore with Gen 3 plants, where you have plants that are really robust to kind of every internal and external threat you can think of, including passive safety features. And I can get into that with CANDU. But just to kind of follow up on the Gen 1, 2, 3, 4, Gen 4, generally considered to be more exotic. It sounds like number 4, like it should be better because it's the last generation to have come. But in fact, actually all Gen 4 concepts were tried in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And I will say that people refer to this as advanced nuclear. I kind of call it failed to advanced nuclear, just more exotic coolants and chemistry. So if you think about using pressurized water in a reactor or boiling water, we've been doing that for 200 plus years since the advent of the Industrial Revolution, using pressure vessels and steam as a working fluid. We have really solved a lot of the engineering problems. There were new ones introduced by nuclear for sure, but that was a much more manageable problem to crack. And when you're talking about circulating radioactive molten salts through pumps and heat exchangers, corrosion challenges, alloy challenges, it becomes more complex. And so I'm not a big Gen 4 promoter. I think they're interesting technologies we should sort of keep in the national labs and develop, and they have some niche applications. But I'm a sort of Gen 3 plus kind of guy. And you brought up the CANDU reactor. Canada is a really, really interesting case study. There are basically 3 reactors that have been widely deployed around the world. 2 are American: the pressurized light water reactor, the boiling light water reactor, and we innovated something called a heavy pressurized water reactor, and that's the CANDU. And basically, Canadian ingenuity coming out of a huge amount of nuclear research that happened in Ontario at Canadian Nuclear Labs, previously Chalk River Laboratories. We were sort of running a Manhattan Project North, or contributing to the nuclear weapons program, looking at using heavy water, which is a really good moderator to run nuclear reactions. And so we took that expertise and that investment. We were the second largest research center in the world for nuclear power after the US post-war. And visionaries like C.D. Howe said we should really take advantage of this. We should look at turning this into a power source, particularly because we don't have coal in Quebec and Ontario. And so to get around some of the bottlenecks and challenges, we never developed uranium enrichment, particularly up until we invented centrifuges when we were doing gas diffusion. It was an incredibly energy-intensive process, and Canada didn't have the resources or the interest in doing that. Also, we didn't have these heavy forging capacities, so taking ignits of kind of not molten but hot steel and working them into large rings for the vessels, the heavy vessels that are required in American style nuclear power. We modularized our core, so we used a design with pressure tubes instead of a big reactor vessel. I won't get too much into the details, but basically allowed us to bypass uranium enrichment and heavy forging, and created a very, very safe reactor because there's just a ton of thermal inertia in the plant. There's a lot of water around that nuclear reaction, and it gives us 24 to 72 hours of sort of coping time before, in an emergency, before we really need to get a lot of active systems up and running. So it's a really fascinating reactor design. I'm a big advocate, particularly in the context of our current kerfuffle, trade kerfuffle, I'll call it, with the Americans. It's an industry that is hyper localized in Canada because it's our reactor. We've developed the expertise and the supply chains for it. And as I was mentioning, it's the 3rd most widely deployed reactor around the world. So we've exported the reactor to India, Pakistan, Korea, China, Romania, and Argentina. And that's pretty impressive for like a tiny little country at the time of like 18 million to punch so high above its weight to develop its own reactor technology, and for that technology to go on to be, the number 3 reactor in the world by deployment.
How are those reactors compared to the SMR, small modular reactors? Is there a big difference in the power output and how they work? What's the difference?
Yeah. So the biggest difference would be precisely that in the power output, small modular reactor. So the small modular reactors that are actually being built in Canada right now are not CANDUs. They're an American design, a boiling water reactor design. About 300 megawatts. So just take that megawatt and think about it as 10,000 households, right? So a 300 megawatt reactor, think of it as 300,000 households. Our large CANDU units are pushing 900 megawatts, so almost 1 million households. Why that matters is nuclear is sort of a slave of economies of scale.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of inherent costs to nuclear, which don't scale down linearly with decreased reactor output. So even if you have, and this comes down to like a lot of the hype right now about microreactors, really small reactors, maybe for data centers or for, the far north or mining or industrial applications. Even if your reactor output is tiny, you still need a lot of shielding. So big, thick, heavy concrete walls to block radiation, usually about a meter thick of concrete. You need civil infrastructure. Nuclear is unique because it produces radiation, which needs to be shielded, and it has decay heat, meaning once you shut the power source off, it's still hot for a long time. And you need to be able to manage and reject that heat. And so that has a lot of engineering challenges. There's also regulatory challenges. You could argue some of them are overblown, but some of them are really important. It's really important to regulate the airline industry, for instance, as well. We really want excellence out of potentially high-risk industries. And so the small modular reactor craze is interesting. I always think of it as more of a branding term. It's a very successful branding term because, people that don't know a lot about nuclear, they sure know about small modular reactors. And it was really an attempt to kind of come up with a marketing solution to some of the challenges nuclear faced, notably the big accidents. So it really came to fore after Fukushima, sort of let's give nuclear a rebrand, and this rebrand has no real record, and so we can say, hey, there's no problems, and it answers all the questions. There's been ridiculous claims that it'll be cheaper than large scale nuclear, and when serious utilities and people looking at deploying it run the economic analyses, they're not. So they have a niche to fill, and that's places like Saskatchewan, they can't accommodate a big gigawatt scale reactor. There's something called N+1 contingency. So you don't want a single power generation unit to be more than about 10% of your grid, because if it trips or goes offline suddenly, you're going to black out if you don't have other generation that you can spin up really quickly, or good interconnections to prevent that. So there are definitely places where we want smaller reactors, but in general, if your grid can take it, it makes a lot more sense to go large, and that's the pattern we've seen in the 70 years of nuclear deployment in the 30 countries around the world that have done it. They've all started with small reactors, and gone up to about that, powering 1 million household levels, 1 gigawatt, 1,000 megawatts.
This podcast episode is powered by ATB Capital Markets. ATB Capital Markets provides financial solutions and strategic advisory services to help businesses thrive. With a track record of successful deal execution, ATB is a full-service investment dealer with a deep understanding and commitment to the industries it serves. Visit atbcapitalmarkets.com for more information. Speaking of accidents, I guess in simple terms, the idea is that things have gotten way better since some of the original problems in the 60s and wherever you want to point towards. But in real simple terms, how much better has the technology got nowadays, and how has that helped with accidents and the concerns of the problems of nuclear energy?
Yeah, so your big three are Chernobyl. Well, actually, run them in order: 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima. Right, and nuclear accidents grab the headlines. There's an association, obviously, with nuclear and radiation, with nuclear weapons, and for a long time, we've had a really appropriate respect and fear for nuclear weapons, and that's translated over to nuclear power, despite the physics being very different. So a nuclear power plant cannot explode like an atomic bomb, for sure. You can have radiation releases, and those can potentially be concerning. But what we've seen, as a medical professional analyzing the work of, the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, the studies of these accidents really show that they've been blown out of proportion in terms of the impacts on human health. And so for the Chernobyl accident, which is really the worst one, the largest release of radiation, we see about 50 deaths directly attributed. And this is to basically thermal burns from the fire and from really, really high doses of radiation. And then it's basically immeasurable, picking up other cancers and diseases that came other than thyroid cancer. And that's really an easy thing to prevent if you're not running a communist state that's trying to cover up everything. So 3 Mile Island, there was no significant radiation release. The containment worked really well. Chernobyl didn't have a containment dome. And so we had, melting of fuel in that plant. And, the largest dose to civilians in the area was, around a chest x-ray of radiation. I dose a lot of radiation in the emergency department, people coming in for CT scans and things like that. So a fraction of those kind of medical doses. And then finally, people will say, Fukushima is really the accident that proved how safe nuclear was, because you had 3 gigawatt scale nuclear power plants melting down, and we don't have a single death as a result. Near term, and we're really not expecting much in terms of long term. So that might sound sort of crazy and counterintuitive. Certainly, there's the potential for bad things to happen, and Chernobyl's a real, a perfect storm of a very imperfect design with some kind of serious vulnerabilities, lack of containment. I won't get into the engineering details, but the possibility for these big power excursions. Combine that with a Soviet state that has incentives to sort of minimize quality control and minimize whistleblowers. You can have an issue like that. I always like to put things in perspective and compare it to the aviation industry. Getting in airplanes is a ridiculous thing to do at face value. Cramming in with another 150 men, women, and children, taking off, cruising up to 30,000 feet, where the oxygen levels, the air is so thin that you'll die in minutes from oxygen deprivation if the cabin depressurizes. You're in this little thin-skinned thing. Putting a lot of faith in those pilots and those mechanics down on the ground and the air traffic controllers. It's a very complex set of systems. People will say there's 10,000 plus mission critical moving parts on a modern jetliner. All that stuff needs to be maintained, and yet it's far safer than driving. 17 times safer than driving. And so, we make dangerous things safe. That's part of what we do in modern industrialized civilizations. And we've learned from each of these accidents, and both the CANDU design and some of the newer iterations of the American designs have gotten us to a place where we have really, really excellent levels of safety. And the number of people that have died in aviation accidents just dwarfs 10 or 100 X's the casualties we've seen from nuclear. And we can't forget as well that there's accidents in coal and natural gas stations and infrastructure, and there is an air pollution burden. It's mitigated a lot by things like particulate scrubbers and coal plants, but fossil fuel burning does result in air pollution, and that has indirect health impacts that dwarf those of radiation releases that we see certainly in everyday operation and even in accident scenarios.
Another point the critic would make is that, but it's the tail risk or the unlikely events that nuclear is the real problem, where the massive, explosion or whatever it is the real worry, maybe in the imaginations of people. But is that accurate or inaccurate? How do you think about the tail risk? Maybe that's something.
Yeah, I mean, the whole job of the regulator, and basically so much of the effort of designing reactors is looking at all of these tail end risks, whether and you need to think about throwing everything at this technology. So whether that's electromagnetic pulses from the Russians detonating a nuclear device in the atmosphere above Canada or the US, and how that can fry a lot of electrical systems. It's not like nuclear regulators or plant designers and operators are going, oh, we never thought about that. Like, they think about every bloody contingency and engineer and human factors the crap out of it to drive those risks as low as possible. And again, there's no Western reactor that's comparable to the Chernobyl reactor. So that really was, again, a pretty much a worst case in terms of the amount of radiation that was released. And so I think that sort of goes to show, particularly as well, this example of, a much older reactor, Gen 2 reactor at 3 Mile Island, melting down and having really no significant radiation release and absolutely no health consequences, actually on-site or off-site. So, are things overblown? Again, make the aviation analogy. Like, would you want to completely deregulate the airline industry? No. It's really important that that we're rigorous there. Aviation's dangerous. You could say, yeah, nuclear is dangerous, but again, we've engineered it. And again, the human factors is important, like the training and things like that. Where the Soviets tried to sort of cover things up and not communicate, one plant had an issue. Well, we don't want to let that get out. Party boss will come and fire us or worse. There's a real collaborative culture, because within nuclear, an injury to one's an injury to all. If there's an incident or an accident, it's a sector that's, very prone to bad public relations. And so there's a lot of sharing of expertise. And that again has resulted in a really exemplary safety culture. I live 60 kilometers from my nearest nuclear power plant. I don't think about it. I mean, I'm glad that it's there because it provides amazing jobs. It's displacing a bunch of air pollution. We used to burn a lot of coal in Ontario. Nuclear is really the power source most responsible for ridding us of coal burning. So yeah, I'm really quite happy living near a nuclear plant, and I don't worry about it.
And how different do you think the Western versions of the nuclear plants are than, say, the Soviet versions that maybe sticks in everyone's mind? Is it night and day? This episode is brought to you by Ambient. Ambient helps energy leaders improve production performance and expand margins through AI-powered optimization. Built on trust, transparency, and collaboration, the Ambient platform turns data into confident decisions, delivering measurable operational impact. Find out how Ambient expands the capacity of your production teams at ambient.com.
I mean, so the Russians have a version of that American style reactor, the pressurized water reactor that they're building, at home. And actually, they're building the most nuclear power plants internationally. They're the number one exporter of nuclear power plants. So they're not exporting their old Chernobyl style reactor. That was the RBMK. They're exporting their pressurized water reactor, the VVER, and it's a very safe reactor that's up to Western standards in terms of its engineering and its containment philosophy and everything else. So yeah, it's no one's building these Chernobyl style reactors anymore. Interestingly, there's still a few in operation. And that was largely a fix in terms of better procedures and human factors training. They didn't put big containment domes over all these other Chernobyl style reactors. Those still operate, and they've been operating very safely for the last little while. They're going to age out, and they are being replaced by, again, these more Western style reactors that Russia also builds. But yeah, I think we're in a pretty good spot, and I'm, really a big advocate of the CANDU reactor. I also think the AP1000, the most sort of recent cutting edge American contribution to the mix, is an awesome reactor. I just think that particularly given our, as I've called it, our trade kerfuffle with the U.S. We should focus on technologies that are going to bring the most benefits to the Canadian worker and the Canadian family, and that's a Canadian reactor technology that we own the IP for and that we control something like 90% of the supply chain for. So what's cool again about CANDU is what we're seeing with some of these projects is, you invest $1, you get $1.40 back in GDP activity. And that's because nuclear construction and nuclear provides the ultimate economic stimulus. It gives lots of jobs, six-figure jobs to tradespeople, operators, engineers, et cetera. And there's no better economic stimulus than having, a really robust, well-paid middle class, because they go on and spend that money and, generate 3 or 4 indirect jobs through their own incomes. So that's a big part of why Ontario is investing big in nuclear now, particularly in the context of the trade war. This is a sovereign industry with an enormous payback. So if you're going to invest in something, you're going to see a real payback in economic stimulus.
And speaking of benefits, I'll get the numbers wrong, but I think they're directionally correct. The reason nuclear is so valuable is the amount of power it gives off. I think Canadian electricity consumption is about 700 terawatts a year. So Calgary, that would be about 15 to 25 terawatts a year. You could get away with maybe 2 to 3 large-scale reactors for a small city like Calgary. For all entire Alberta demand, which is about 80 to 85 terawatts a year, you could get away with about 10 to 11 large-scale reactors. So that may not be totally accurate, but the idea is that you don't need a lot of these things to power massive populations.
And that's kind of what's astounding, right? And the aesthetic of nuclear is, well, it's these like big, massive power plants, and they must have such a big impact on the environment and blah, 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 blah. But when you realize how much power is coming out of one station, it's absolutely bonkers. Mm-hmm. So that's exactly right. I'd have to double check your numbers, but it sounds about right. If Calgary, what's the population of Calgary? 3 million, 4 million?
Greater Calgary, maybe up about 1.5 or 2 million now.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I mean, so yeah, three large CANDU reactors would be able to provide the power there. Of course, power, varies, and that's where nuclear is great at providing that baseload as part of your power really reliably. Yeah. But you do need, obviously, to dispatch more generation for things like, it's not your Chinooks as the cold spells or the hot spells. I can't remember. Anyway, your guys' weather is fucking crazy. So you do need those dispatchable sources as well. It's interesting. Like people will criticize nuclear energy because it's inflexible, right? Like the capital costs are so high, the fuel's so cheap that you want to run these things, all out 100% of the time. And we usually get to sort of high 80s, mid 90s, which means, it's a really reliable bedrock source of power. But obviously, grid demand goes up and down, and it goes down at nights. And so the value of that power might be lower. In Ontario, our power demands, and I think a lot of places are really going to be seasonally affected. So we have, the lake effect. We get really hot weather in the summer, heat waves that just completely destroy wind power. For instance, our wind turbine fleet drops, from its 5,000 megawatt capacity down to, a few tens of megawatts when we have a heat wave. That's when we keep our nuclear plants all online. We have 16 of them operating right now, and they go bonkers around the clock. And then in our shoulder seasons in the spring and fall, there's not a big heating demand, not a big aircon demand. We do our maintenances and things like that. So there's a way for nuclear to sort of load follow kind of on a seasonal basis. And lastly, it works really well with storage, right? I think there's a bit of an energy culture war happening, and I've certainly been a part of it. I think I'm kind of maturing a little bit out of it, but wind, solar bad, batteries bad, yada yada yada. Solar's great if you have great solar resources and you can sort of build enough of it, but not too much of it. Wind, I'm not very bullish on at all. But batteries are freaking incredible. Like California, last time I checked, if they discharge all their batteries at once, it's something like 16 gigawatts. Like they could power 16 million households, not for that long, right? But if you divide that by 4 and then you run those for 4 hours, that's significant. In addition, pumped hydro is really cool. Nuclear works better than renewables to charge these things because it's reliable. It's on all the time. So, there's a lot of interesting nuance, I think, to the energy culture wars, some of which is a really important war to fight because we don't want to, too much unreliable power on a grid. Alberta came pretty close to blacking out. I think January of 2023, renewables were missing in action. So we just need to have, a kind of science-based, not ideological-based approach, I think, to looking at, what are the best sources of energy in whatever environment we're plugging them into.
Yeah, some of the main pillars of energy sources are that it needs to be reliable and available. And actually, it was even last year, Alberta had problems with power where they had provinces asking people to ration. So the idea with nuclear energy is that maybe you don't get 10 full-scale reactors built, but maybe 1 or 2, and you have a baseload for redundancy in the power grid. And it seems like a good idea.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good way to put it. Good rationale. That being said, you do want to build certainly more than one. The economics, again, economies of scale don't just apply to like a single reactor's output, but to a nuclear site. If you have a site with 1 reactor on it, that means again if you had 2 reactors, you'd have essentially the same security. You'd have your waste storage facility would be 1 building for 2 reactors output, and you can just do all of the kind of mental math on every input to nuclear, and there are a lot. From a regulatory perspective, we call a non-proliferation perspective, shared infrastructure for bringing in cooling water to a nuclear plant. If you can divide that between 2 or 3 units, that always makes sense, and that is one other argument for small modular reactors in smaller locations. Hopefully that I don't want to riff too far on any one idea. As you can see, I can get a little tangential.
Yeah, idea of the last few years among energy security problems has been the reframing of nuclear energy from risky to a green technology. Have you found that to be effective in your messaging to people?
Yeah. I mean, I don't necessarily say green. My focus has been more on labor. Again, I'm a huge advocate of a robust, healthy middle class being the basis for a stable, prosperous, high trust society. And great way to do that is with high quality jobs. And so that's something where we've really seen something that's referred to by political scientists as the kind of great political realignment, and that's been with the left losing touch with its blue collar base, its working class base. Left parties sort of came out of union movements representing coal workers and auto plant workers, and so in Canada we have our left wing parties, the New Democratic Party. It's really become a party that represents more of what we call sort of the cappuccino socialists or the champagne socialists, hyper educated elites, usually with humanities degrees that don't really understand the material world and just how how industry and supply chains and everything run. And so that political party's become completely, it's got a tension in it that's easy to wedge between, okay, you're trying to represent, the auto workers in Oshawa. You're trying to represent, all the skilled tradespeople that work in this incredible nuclear ecosystem, because their interests are quite different from degrowther environmentalists in downtown Toronto. So I would say, I love the environment. I am a passionate hunter. I was a guide in the Yukon Territory. It sucks that I live in Toronto, man. Are you in Calgary?
I am.
Yeah, I am super jelly, and as soon as my son's 18, I'm cutting out of this place, and I'll come to hang out with you out there, Trevor. We'll do this interview in person.
Yeah.
And my messaging has been more on that sort of labor issue, and that's been really effective at bringing the NDP to heel. And we've seen that provincially, finally, at a policy convention this year. They came out in support of nuclear energy, very much on the labor grounds. And yeah, even the Green Party in Ontario, they're not thrilled about building new nuclear, but they say we should keep the existing stuff open because it's, it is actually on a life cycle basis, even with the mining and the construction and the disposal of waste, it's still the lowest carbon energy that exists on planet Earth.
This podcast episode is brought to you by JSG Professional Services, Canada's leader in pipeline construction management and inspection resources. JSG provides competent, qualified, and verified pipeline construction management and inspection resources, supporting Canada's largest pipeline companies from initial development through final execution. Whether your project involves new pipeline construction, integrity programs, maintenance pump stations, compressor stations, or inline inspections, JSG has consistently delivered experienced professionals to Canada's energy industry. Visit gsginc.com to learn more. Yeah, another criticism is that the cost of nuclear is way too high, and as a result, it has to be developed by government. So I guess the question is, how do you foresee or how do you enable private industry and entrepreneurs? Do you think it's possible to be a nuclear entrepreneur, to make advancements? Have you thought about that? What do you think?
Oh, buddy. No, I think about that stuff all the time. And yeah, it is a hard sector to imagine a kind of pure entrepreneurial play. I mean, certainly it's not like in Ontario, the whole nuclear industry is government owned or government run. Unlike Alberta, which has sort of an energy only merchant market selling electricity, we have a bit of a hybrid system, but it's much more along that old model of, a big regulated utility, which is able to handle, large capital cost projects for the benefit of 30, 40 years of cheap, reliable power for its ratepayers. We have a whole, healthy cluster of private suppliers that feed into those power plants. And so there is it's not like kind of a communist energy source. But that being said, because by very nature it's capital intensive, this isn't, return on investments of 5 years. It takes quite a while to pay off a really capital intensive project. It's kind of like saying, could you imagine having, is this a sector that could be disrupted by entrepreneurs? Like, is hydroelectricity a sector we could really interrupt with an entrepreneurial private sector only sort of framework? And it's like, not really. I guess you could build like a 1 megawatt dam over here and string a huge amount of transmission down to Calgary. It just doesn't make sense, man. You kind of got to build big for nuclear, and that does involve a certain amount of government and private sector cooperation. But I mean, there again, like the Hoover Dam in the U.S. was there's a lot of involvement, Army Corps of Engineers, a lot of coordination. I'm not exactly sure how it was funded, but certainly it wasn't privately funded only. But there were 4 or 5 big private contractors that helped build that big behemoth. And I think hydroelectricity is a great sort of parallel way to understand nuclear, because nuclear is really prone to what not what I call, but just, what are called category errors, right? So it's easy to, if what you're familiar with is a combined cycle gas turbine, well, I don't know, nuclear, it's a thermal power source. It boils steam and runs a turbine. How different could it be? It's pretty different. And that's what my sort of 8-year journey deep diving this topic has really taught me. But certainly, like you are seeing a lot of interest from Silicon Valley, from disruptors looking at nuclear and saying, "Hey, I mean, this power source is like 70,000 times more energy dense than natural gas. Like it's just an extraordinary phenomenon in terms of harnessing that strong nuclear force, splitting atoms. It produces an enormous amount of heat with a tiny amount of fuel. Like why isn't this everywhere? Like why hasn't it replaced every other form of power generation? Why is it so expensive?" And so there's a kind of disruptor mentality coming out of, very well capitalized folks, particularly now with AI and hyperscalers, looking at like, is there a way to disrupt the nuclear sector? And it's compelling, right? Like, what about SpaceX? Like they drove down this big burdensome government-run NASA launch services model and absolutely revolutionized it. And so it's like, man, it's a great narrative. Could we do that with nuclear? I wish we could. What's really illustrative, and I think a good way to think about this, and what you'll hear from a lot of people that are trying to get around this issue of, well, if it's a big capital intensive project, maybe we can reduce the capital cost by going smaller, small modular reactor, even micro reactor, is this idea of let's build airplanes, not airports. Right. And so the airport is this big gigawatt scale reactor, all this concrete, steel, yada, 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 like the microreactor play. Like, what if we can just drive up with a truck and drop one of these things off and just leave it there, plug it into the grid, snap it together like Lego, whatever you kind of marketing terms you want to hear. And it's an attractive idea, but airplanes don't work without airports. Right. So even with that small reactor, you still need a fairly decent sized airport for it. And like other things like, electric vehicles, for instance, when you build an electric vehicle, you're not having to build the whole highway for it. Like the public has provided that, an airport as well. And with a nuclear reactor, you're responsible for the base mat and all of the cooling infrastructure and everything else. So you don't escape that. So it's not like rockets. It would kind of be like for every rocket you needed to build its own launch pad. Right? No, you're able to sort of use the same launch pad for a product that is kind of modular, that fails really quickly. Like, you need to run a rocket for 90 seconds, 2 minutes to get it into orbit. You can really tinker and do a lot of sort of destructive testing, figure out what works, doesn't work. Nuclear just iterates on a really different cycle. Takes a long time. So, when you talk about the kind of Silicon Valley finance perspective, let's get some minimal viable product, some software out there. It doesn't suck if it it doesn't matter if it sort of sucks. We'll get sort of feedback from beta testers. We'll, develop it. And then we can just copy print software and it's sort of infinitely scalable and can, give us that sort of 1,000x return that happens with Silicon Valley financing when you strike gold with a product like Airbnb or Uber or something like that. But nuclear ain't software. Each unit that you sell, again, has got a shit ton of concrete and steel to make it earthquake proof, to shield the radiation, to manage the decay heat. So it's fundamentally a category error. So while I'm bullish and I've been a bit of an evangelist for nuclear, I'm also really tied to a careful analysis of this technology so we don't overpromise and underdeliver. So for me, again, it's big reactors where you can fit them. It's this highly developed, highly advanced, conventional water-cooled, water-moderated reactor technology that's proven itself over and over again. And what we need to do is get good at building big things again. China's kicking ass. They're building nuclear plants, not quite as cheap as coal, but pretty darn cheap. 1/5 the cost of what we build them for in the West. So we don't build bridges well, we don't build airports well, we don't build high-speed rail well in the West, and we don't build nuclear well. That suggests to me a sort of civilizational crisis and a focus on how do we build big things, and that's going to involve government. So in terms of the political edge on all this, it's nuanced and tricky.
As we move towards the end of the conversation, you think a lot about nuclear, but what's the biggest misconception maybe the public has about the technology nowadays, and how are you overcoming it?
Yeah, I'd say the nuclear waste thing. If I talk about the public, right, like I'm sort of beyond thinking about this stuff these days because there's such broad social license. I'm really focused now on, again, misallocations of capital based on categories like I just discussed. But for the general public, who I sometimes lose touch with because of how nerded out I am and focused on this topic, I think the waste issue is the big sort of boogeyman of nuclear. And I would just reframe the waste issue as nuclear has the best waste. It produces tiny, tiny volumes. It's solid. It doesn't leak or spill or go anywhere. We keep it in these concrete and steel casks after cooling it off in a water bath for 5 years. Just sits there. It's boring. And ultimately it gets safer with time. So, while fresh out of the reactor, if you have no shielding and you just, stood in front of a freshly irradiated spent fuel bundle, you die in seconds. So it's dangerous, right? But we make dangerous things safe, just as the kind of airline example I was giving you before. And we have a perfect track record of managing that waste. So if you compare that again to, particulate from coal burning, or even, nitrous oxide from, burning natural gas and causing a bit of smog, those are sort of uncontained waste streams. Even hydroelectricity, right? You flood a bunch of vegetation, it releases methyl mercury that accumulates up the food chain, it gets into fish, maybe can cause damage to people that are, dependent on a fish-based diet in northern Quebec or whatever. Nuclear has none of those problems. It's not that it's not something that needs to be solved, and I think we really kind of have solved it, but it gets safer with time. That's the other really interesting thing. So, as I mentioned, fresh out of the reactor, the stuff will kill you in seconds. Give it 200-300 years, and the penetrating radiation has left the material. It's gone, right? And it's been contained by these concrete and steel casks. What you're left with is radiation that can only harm at very short distances. And so, you have to figure out how would you deliver that danger to a member of the public. And basically, after 400 or 500 years, you'd have to take the nuclear waste pellets, grind them up into a powder, and find some way to ingest, inhale, snort it. And it's just kind of hard to figure out the scenario in which that happens. So again, I'm very comfortable with nuclear waste. I think, all waste is a problem that needs to be solved, but I think nuclear is really actually one of the most solvable, most contained, most responsibly managed sources of waste. So that'd be my myth busting 101.
And the way it's been framed to me with basically all energy sources is probabilities, where you have to weigh the good with the bad. So how much upside compared to downside do you think exists with nuclear energy? And I guess it's a question of risk management.
Yeah, I think there's enormous upside. And the real challenge for me is not, and the risks are not, safety risks, because we've learned how to manage those so well. And, even in a worst case scenario, it's, Chernobyl, it's modest compared to other forms of disaster or accidents, or, hydroelectric dam breaking and releasing and inundating, whole towns, kills thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, right? But the risk is in terms of, can we build these things anymore in the West? Can we get them done on budget and on time? And the answer there is not, fancy new shiny reactors. The actual reactor itself, the nuclear steam supply system, is a minority of the cost of building a nuclear power plant. So much of it is building that airport. And so we have to get good at building airports again. We have to get good at building nuclear power plants, pouring concrete, laying rebar, skilled trades, the project management. And hopefully that's a risk that we can mitigate and get better at, so that we can unlock the potential of a technology that has enormous upside.
Because we need energy for technology, which makes human lives better at the end of the day.
Amen, brother.
I really appreciate your time today. Thank you for part 2. And unless there's anything else you want to add, we can end the formal conversation there.
Yeah, no, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me back, Trevor.